Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing stories the Appalachian Mountains have ever seen. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, please leave a comment below and tell us where you're joining us on this trip into the past. Picture a place where mountains stand like quiet protectors of old secrets, and morning mist creeps through the valleys like ghosts looking for a way out. Kentucky has always been a place of wild beauty and deep isolation in the middle of the Appalachians. As the world outside fell into the horrors of the Great War in 1916, these mountains had their own secrets hidden in the folds of their dark valleys. The Holle family lived on a piece of land in Harland County that was far away from other people. It was covered in thick forest and steep hills. The main house, which was made of logs that had darkened over time, stood at the end of a dirt road that wound through the mountain like an old scar. Thomas Holloway got the land from his father, who got it from his grandfather. This is a family line that has been lost in the mists of time. The land was cut off from the rest of the world not only because it was far away, but also because of the terrain. There were deep ravines, icy streams, and plants so thick that sunlight barely reached the forest floor. Back then, living in the mountains meant living on the edge of the modern world. News came late, if it came at all. Families were completely cut off from their closest neighbors who lived miles away. In the winter, when snow blocked the dangerous roads, they were even more cut off. It was a way of life that required strength, but it also made people feel lonely in a strange way that changed who they were. People in the area knew Thomas as a man who didn't say much and had a faraway look in his eyes. People in town didn't see his wife, Margaret, very often. People in the area talked about how pale she was and how her eyes seemed to be looking for something beyond the mountains, as if she wanted to get away from something she couldn't see. In addition to the couple, there were 3 adults living on the property. 2 of Thomas's brothers, and a distant cousin of Margaret's who had lost her own family in a typhoid fever epidemic and moved in with them. The Holloway property had an interesting feature that only a few people who went there noticed. An old stone building that was half buried in the hillside behind the main house. Some people thought it was a winery, while others thought it might have been an old mine. Thomas never gave any reasons, and no one had the guts to ask him directly. There was a big wooden door that was always locked, and the windows were so small and high that they were almost useless. It looked like nature was trying to hide the stones by covering them with moss and vines. In the fall of that year, a traveling doctor named Jonathan Pierce came through the area. He went from town to town, offering his services in the most remote parts of the Appalachian Mountains. One afternoon, while he was treating a farmer with pneumonia a few miles from the Hollow property, he heard something that made him want to know more. The farmer's wife, who was very religious and went to the small Baptist church in the valley, said in a low voice that there was something wrong with that family on the mountain. She didn't know what it was, but she could feel in her spirit that something evil was there. Pierce was a scientist, but he also knew a lot about local superstitions, so he decided to visit the Holles. He got there on a gray, late afternoon, when the valleys were already starting to be eaten by shadows. Thomas was polite but cold when he saw him on the porch. He didn't invite him in. Margaret showed up at the window for a moment, her face a pale mask against the dark inside the house. The doctor saw something strange in her eyes. Not fear, but a deep sense of giving up, as if she had given up on something important a long time ago. Pierce heard noises coming from the stone building on the hill, while he and Thomas talked about the weather and the harvest. The sounds were muffled and hard to tell what they were. When Thomas asked about the structure, Thomas said it was just a storage shed for tools and food for the winter. But the way he quickly changed the subject and the way his eyes darted away made the doctor suspicious. Pierce couldn't sleep that night at the farmer's house. Along with the picture of Margaret's pale face and the strange sounds coming from the stone building, the woman's words kept coming back to him. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to learn something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It would show him that sometimes the darkest secrets aren't hidden in big cities, but lost in the forgotten folds of the mountains, where no one hears or sees. In the days that followed, Pierce felt restless in a way he couldn't fully explain. He kept going to the farms in the area, treating fevers, injuries, and the common illnesses of that harsh mountain life. But his mind kept going back to that lonely property, to Margaret's empty gaze, and to the sounds coming from the stone building. He casually talked about his visit to the Holloways while he was at the small grocery store that the community used as a meeting place. The response was quick and telling. The group of men talking near the wood-burning stove fell silent. They looked at each other. People nervously cleared their throats. Finally, an old farmer named Ezekiel, who had white hair and calloused hands from working for decades, pulled Pierce to a quieter part of the room. Ezekiel's story was broken up and full of pauses. He talked about old rumors, things that no one could prove but that everyone knew were true. He said that the Holloway family had deep roots in that land, going back to when there weren't many laws and each property was like its own kingdom. He said that Thomas's grandfather was a scary man who people didn't want to see when he came to town. There were stories about travelers who had stayed on that property during storms and never came back, but these were just rumors that couldn't be proven. Pierce felt a shiver go down his back. He was curious as to why no one had ever looked into these suspicions. Ezekiel shrugged and looked very tired. How could someone look into rumors in mountains where homes were hours apart? When there were no witnesses and only the people involved knew what happened, how could anyone prove anything? The county officials were far away, and even if someone made a formal complaint, what would they look into? Are your suspicions based on feelings and old stories? But there was something else. Ezekiel said that some members of the Holloway family had left without warning in the past few years. A distant uncle who lived with them just stopped coming to town. Thomas said that the man had chosen to go west in search of his fortune in the lands beyond the Mississippi when someone asked. No one doubted it because there was no reason to. A lot of people left the mountains in search of a better life after all. That night, Pierce lay awake in a borrowed bed, listening to the wind howl through the trees. He wasn't the type to act on impulse, but he couldn't ignore how he felt either. He had spent too many years treating injuries that didn't make sense, hearing explanations that didn't make sense, and seeing the fear in the eyes of people who were too afraid to tell the truth. He could tell that something was wrong, even though it was hidden by layers of silence and loneliness. The next morning, he made a choice that would change the story's course. He would go back to the whole estate, but this time he would have a better medical reason. He would bring medicine with him so that he could give everyone in the house a free consultation. It wasn't unusual for traveling doctors to do this in poor areas, so it wouldn't raise any red flags right away. He had to go inside that house and talk to Margaret by herself if possible. He had to know what really happened there, where the law and the world had forgotten about it. It took almost all morning to get to the property. The path twisted and turned through tall pine trees that blocked the sun, making it look like it was always twilight. As he climbed, the air got colder, and a constant mist stuck to his skin like icy fingers. He saw something different when he finally saw the house. There was smoke coming out of the main chimney, and also from a hole at the top of the stone building. There was a fire going on inside, and someone was there. When Pierce got there, Thomas was in the barn. He came out with a look on his face that showed surprise and something that could be wrong. Pierce talked about his charitable work and offered to check on all the residents for free. It was hard to say no to such an offer, especially since medical care was hard to come by at the time. Thomas agreed, but only after making it clear that the meetings would be held in the main room and that he would be there for all of them. Even though there was a fire in the fireplace, the house was dark and cold inside. The small windows let in very little light, and there was a strange smell in the air that Pierce couldn't quite put his finger on. It felt like the place had been hiding secrets for decades. The first person to be examined was Margaret. She sat in a wooden chair, and her hands shook a little in her lap. Pierce saw marks on her wrists that looked like something had pressed hard against her skin. When he asked about them, she mumbled something about hurting herself while working on the farm, but her eyes silently begged for something Pierce couldn't understand. Was it help? Was it a sign? The other residents were looked at one by one. For the time, they were all in pretty good health, but there was a lot of tension in them, like animals that are trapped and know something is wrong but can't get out. Thomas's younger brother had scars on his back that he wouldn't talk about. Margaret's cousin only spoke in one word at a time and didn't look anyone in the eye. Pierce stayed alert the whole time. He heard noises coming from other parts of the house, like footsteps upstairs and doors closing quietly, and that stone building outside always seemed like a threatening presence in his mind. What was going on at that place? What were those people hiding? Not just from the police, but maybe even from themselves. Pierce knew that what he was seeing was only the tip of the iceberg, that there was something much deeper and more disturbing that the mountains keep quiet about. Pierce took his time putting his medical tools away in his leather bag and looking at every detail of the house. The dim light coming in through the windows made long shadows on the dark wood walls. He saw something strange, scratch marks on some of the doors inside, as if someone had tried hard to open them. Thomas stayed close by, watching the doctor with an obsession-like level of attention. Pierce casually said as he was about to leave that he had seen smoke coming from the stone building and asked if anyone else there needed medical help. It felt like the room got colder right away. Thomas stiffened and clenched his jaw. He quickly said that there was no one there, just food being smoked for the winter. The explanation seemed to make sense at first, but the fact that the other residents all looked away at the same time, and the speed of the response confirmed Pierce's suspicions. The doctor left while Thomas watched, but he didn't ride right away. He knew those mountains well, so he walked around the property on old hunting trails and set himself up on a rise where he could see the stone building without being seen. He tied his horse up far enough away that it wouldn't make any noise. Then he hid in the thick bushes and planned to keep watch for a few hours. The sun slowly set behind the mountain peaks, coloring the sky with orange and red hues that looked like a bad sign. Pierce waited with the patience of someone who knew that old secrets are hard to find. The temperature dropped quickly, so he pulled his coat tighter around him. For a long time, nothing happened. The mountains were quiet, except for the occasional hoot of an owl or the sound of branches cracking under the weight of a small animal. Then, when it was already dark in the valley, he saw something move. Thomas came out of the main house with what looked like a tray covered in a cloth. He carefully looked around before walking toward the stone building. Pierce saw him unlock the heavy door and go inside, quickly closing it behind him. There was a faint light coming through the small, tall windows, which was probably from an oil lamp. Thomas stayed inside for a long time, maybe half an hour. When he finally came out, he wasn't carrying the tray anymore, but his face looked troubled, as if he had just done something that made him feel bad. He carefully locked the door and checked it twice to make sure it was safe before going back to the main house. Pierce's heart raced. There was definitely something or someone in that building that the family didn't want anyone else to see. But what could it be? And why? There were a lot of bad things that could happen to him, and each one was worse than the last. He knew he needed help and couldn't deal with this on his own. But who could he turn to in a place where the law was far away and family ties were stronger than any sense of right and wrong? Pierce wrote a long letter to a friend who worked for the Harland County government that night at the house where he was staying. He talked about what he saw, what he thought, and the fear that hung over the Holle property. But after reading his own words again, he saw how weak his proof was. He didn't have any real proof of anything illegal, just gut feelings and strange actions. He knew that a formal investigation would need more than that, especially since the family had lived on that land for generations. He then decided to wait until he had more information before calling the police. He talked quietly to the oldest people in the area for the next few days. These people had memories from decades ago. An elderly woman who lived in a run-down hut by a stream remembered Thomas's mother. She was a woman who rarely smiled and died young in a way that no one questioned at the time. They said it was a fever, but no doctor had ever looked at her. A different farmer, this one who lived closer to the Holloway property, said that at night he sometimes heard strange noises coming from that direction. Not quite screams, but something between moans and groans that the wind carried through the valleys. He always thought they were wild animals, maybe mountain lions or coyotes, but he was never sure. Now that he heard Pierce's questions, he was starting to think that those sounds might have come from somewhere else. Pierce made a mental map of the Holle family, looking for patterns and connections. He learned that many people had lived on that property over the years and then just stopped being talked about. There were always good reasons for their absence. They moved to a different area, died of natural causes, or left to look for work. But when you look at all of these absences together, they make a disturbing pattern. The land itself was also a question. The property was huge and far away, with deep valleys and forests so thick that no one dared to go there. There were natural caves all over the limestone slopes. Some were known, and others were probably hidden by years of plants. It was the kind of place where secrets could be buried, both literally and figuratively, because the mountains were so quiet that they swallowed everything. The doctor started to realize that what he was dealing with was more than just a mystery. This was a pattern of behavior that had been passed down through the generations, like a dark cloud that had settled over that family. Thomas wasn't a monster who woke up one day and decided to do bad things. Maybe he was the result of something much older and deeper that his mountains had seen and kept quiet about for too long. Pierce knew he was getting close to a point of no return. Every question he asked and every conversation he started made it more likely that Thomas would find out about his informal investigation. And if that happened, in the mountains where it took days for the law to get there, and where accidents happened all the time, he could easily become just another story of a traveler who died on the dangerous Appalachian trails. But something inside him, maybe his promise to protect lives or just his humanity, wouldn't let him leave it behind and act like nothing had happened. On a cold morning when the dew covered everything with a layer of icy moisture, Pierce made his decision. The mountain looked even more ghostly then. He had to look inside that stone building. He had to make sure his suspicions were true before doing anything else. He knew he was taking a big risk, but the picture of Margaret's pale face and that silent, pleading look wouldn't leave him alone. He thought carefully about how he would do it. He would wait for a night without a moon, when the darkness would be total and the shadows would cover everything. He knew a lot about how rural families lived back then. They went to bed early, tired from working hard all day, and got up before dawn. There would be a time of a few hours, from midnight to dawn, when everyone would be sound asleep. On the chosen night, Pierce rode to a place near the property and tied up his horse in a thickly wooded area. He kept walking, carefully stepping through the shadows so that each step didn't make a sound. The forest around us was full of nighttime sounds like the rustling of leaves, the distant hooting of owls, and the creaking of branches in the wind. These sounds, which he was used to, helped him hide what he was doing. When he finally saw the property, the main house was completely dark. There was only a faint light coming from one of the upstairs windows. It was probably a candle that someone forgot to light. The stone building was in the dark, and its shadowy shape stood out against the sky, which was a little less dark. As he got closer, Pierce's heart raced, and all of his senses were on high alert. As expected, the door was locked. He shook his hands as he looked at the lock and took out a small set of tools from the medical bag he always carried with him in case of emergencies. He worked for what felt like hours, even though it was cold, and sweat dripped down his back. Finally, he heard the soft click of the lock giving way. He slowly pushed the door, ready to face resistance or some kind of alarm. But it opened quietly on hinges that were well oiled. The smell that hit him was the first sign that something was very wrong. It wasn't exactly rotten, but it smelled like thick, stale air that hadn't moved around in a while, mixed with something he couldn't quite place. He turned on a small lamp he had brought with him and kept the light low. The inside of the building was bigger than it looked from the outside. The floor sloped down gently, making use of the hill's natural slope. The stone walls were wet and had mold on some of them. As Thomas had said, there were shelves with supplies, but they only took up a small part of the room. The chains, which were held in place by iron rings set into the stone walls, caught his eye. There were heavy chains that ended in shackles that had been used. In a corner, there were dirty and stained blankets stacked up. There were putter plates, some of which still had food on them. There were scratches on the stone and marks on the walls that looked like human nails had scraped there in a hurry. Pierce's legs started to give out. This wasn't just a cellar or a storage room, it was a prison. Someone had been kept there, maybe for days or even months. The used blankets, chains, leftover food, and smell of people being held showed that something was wrong. But where was the person now? The padlocks were open and the chains were empty. His lamp lit up every dark corner as he looked around the room more closely. He found something at the very back that made his blood run cold. A small group of personal things. A broken comb, some buttons from clothes, pieces of torn fabric, and, oddly enough, yellowed pages from a diary. He picked up the pages with shaky hands and moved them closer to the light. It was clear that the writing was uneven and done in bad conditions, with charcoal instead of ink. Some of the entries were broken up and hard to read, but what he could make out painted a scary picture. They talked about being alone, getting punished for things they thought they had done wrong, and being under so much control that they couldn't be free. The author of the pages named Thomas and other family members, which suggests that they all knew about and were involved in this imprisonment. What upset Pierce the most was that those pages were old, dating back years. The faded ink and yellowed paper showed that they had been written a long time ago. This meant that the practice of keeping someone locked up there wasn't new. It had been going on for years, maybe even decades. And if that person wasn't there anymore, where could they be? Did they finally get away, or did something bad happen? Pierce put some of the pages in his coat because he knew he would need proof. He kept looking and found more disturbing signs. Marks on the floor where chains had been dragged over and over again, making grooves in the stone. A small hole in the wall that let in fresh air, and candle stubs, which showed that whoever was there had spent a lot of time in the dark. He was so focused on his investigation that he could barely hear the footsteps outside. Almost. He turned his head back and put out the lamp in one quick motion. He was completely engulfed in darkness and couldn't move. The footsteps got closer slowly and with doubt. Someone was walking toward the stone building. Pierce was frantically looking for a place to hide. There wasn't much room and even fewer choices. He squeezed into a corner behind a pile of old boxes and prayed that the shadows would keep him safe. He was sure he would be heard because his heart was beating so fast. The footsteps stopped right in front of the door. There was a long, tense silence. Pierce could hear someone breathing heavily outside. Anyone who was there knew something was wrong. The door was open and unlocked. He held his breath and tensed every muscle in his body, ready to run or fight if he had to. The quiet was like a rope that was about to break. Then, To his great relief, the footsteps got quieter, but not toward the main house. They went around the building to the side. Pierce's fear grew as he realized that whoever it was looking for people who were hiding nearby. He had to leave right away. But now, any movement would be seen. He was stuck between the proof he had found and the fact that he was about to get caught trespassing. The night in the Kentucky mountains had never felt so long and full of threats that couldn't be seen. Pierce stood still in the dark, hardly daring to breathe, while the footsteps continued their methodical search around the building. The person was being very careful, stopping every few meters as if they were listening for any strange sounds. Even though it was a cold night, the doctor could feel beads of cold sweat running down his forehead. He was starting to feel tingly in his legs because he was in an uncomfortable position behind the boxes, but he didn't want to move. Finally, after what felt like forever, the footsteps came back to the front of the building. There was a long pause, and Pierce could picture the person standing there, staring at the half-open door and thinking about what to do. Then, to his surprise, the door started to open slowly. A dim light from a lamp filled the room, making the wet stone walls look like they were dancing. It was her, Margaret. She walked in slowly, her hand shaking as she held the lamp. Her face showed fear, but also something else, maybe determination or despair. She looked around the room with her eyes, obviously looking for something or someone. Pierce could see her face better now that the light was shining directly on it. He saw that she was crying without saying a word. Her voice was so low that Pierce could barely hear her when she whispered into the dark, "Please, if anyone here can help me, I need you to know the truth." She waited, as if she really thought someone would answer. The quiet went on and on. Pierce was in a terrible situation. Should he show himself? Was it safe to trust her, or was it a complicated trap? Margaret kept talking, as if she needed to say those words out loud, even if no one was listening. "I know what happened here. I know what they did. What we did." Her voice broke. "God forgive me. I knew and couldn't do anything about it." She walked up to the empty chains and touched them with her shaking fingers. "This isn't the first time, and I'm afraid it won't be the last. There's something wrong with this family that goes back a long way. My husband learned it from his father, who learned it from his grandfather. It's like there's a darkness that passes from generation to generation, a need to control, to keep secrets, and to hide those they think bring shame." Pierce stood still, taking in every word. It wasn't Margaret who was talking to him. She was admitting to the emptiness itself, to the walls that had seen so much pain. She went on, "I thought I could change this when I got married. I thought my love could heal him from this darkness, but I can't. I'm too weak, or maybe I've already been corrupted by being here so long." She looked at the diary pages that Pierce had left a little messy because he was in a hurry. "You found her words, didn't you? The woman who was here before, Thomas's sister, the one everyone thinks went away to live with distant relatives." Margaret laughed bitterly. "There are no far-off relatives, only these mountains and the secrets they hold." The doctor felt like someone had hit him in the stomach. Thomas's sister. That made a lot of sense, but it also made everything even more disturbing. A family that locked up its own members and kept them hidden from the world for reasons he still didn't fully understand. What kind of crazy behavior was this in the past? Margaret suddenly turned and looked right at the spot where Pierce was hiding. He was scared for a moment that she had seen him, but then he realized that she was looking right through him, lost in her own painful memories. "If anyone finds out," she said softly, "if the police come, we'll all be judged. Not just Thomas, but me too. His brothers, his cousin, we all knew. We all took part. even if it was just by not saying anything. Her shoulders shook, and she started to cry more openly. But what can I do? Where can I go? I only know these mountains. If I tell someone, who will believe me? They'll think I'm crazy or blame me as much as they blame him. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm as guilty as anyone. Pierce felt a mix of horror and compassion wash over him. Margaret was just as stuck as anyone who had ever been chained up there. Her chains were invisible. They were made of fear, hopelessness, and years of conditioning that made her think there was no way out. She was both a victim and an accomplice at the same time, a living contradiction that those mountains seemed to make happen too often. Margaret wiped her tears with her apron and got ready to leave after a few minutes. She stopped at the door and looked back one last time. "Whoever was here tonight," she said softly, "leave it behind. There is no salvation for us there. There is only the darkness we choose, or the darkness imposed upon us. And in the end, perhaps they are the same thing." She said those awful things and then closed the door behind her. Pierce heard the key turn in the lock. He sat in total darkness, going over everything he had heard. Margaret's confession confirmed his worst fears, but it also showed him that things were more complicated than he had thought. This wasn't just a bad guy and innocent victims. It was a web of complicity and suffering that affected the whole family and was passed down through the generations like a cursed inheritance. Now he had a new problem. He was stuck inside that stone building, which had been a prison for other people before him. It was clear that there was irony. He looked around blindly for another way out, but the walls were solid, except for the small, high opening he had seen before. It was too small for an adult to fit through, but maybe he could stack the boxes. He worked in the dark, moving slowly so he wouldn't make any noise. In the quiet of the night, every sound seemed louder. He carefully stacked the boxes to see if they would stay put. When he finally made it to the top, he found that the opening was even smaller than it had looked. He would have to bend over and probably leave his medical bag and some other things behind. He was able to squeeze through the opening after a lot of work and a few painful scratches. He fell hard on the wet ground covered in leaves on the other side. He lay there for a moment, catching his breath and listening closely for any sign that someone had noticed he was gone. The house stayed dark and quiet. Pierce sped through the woods as fast as he could in the dark. His head was full of thoughts that didn't agree with each other. There was proof of horrible crimes, but there was also a moral gray area that made him unsure of what to do next. It was clear that Margaret was in pain, but she was also guilty. How could he tell who was a victim and who was a perpetrator when the lines were so blurry? And most importantly, what had happened to Thomas's sister? Where was she now? The answer was hidden in the mountain's quiet shadows. Pierce's mind was tortured for the next few days. He went back to his normal visits to the farms for medical care, but he couldn't stop thinking about the property in the mountains and the secrets he had found there. The pages of the diary he had with him burned like embers in his pocket. They were real proof of something terrible, but they were also too broken up to tell the whole story. He read and reread those yellowed pages by candlelight when he couldn't sleep. The messy handwriting showed not only words, but also feelings. Some entries were written with strong strokes and clear anger. Some were so hard to read that it looked like the person writing them was shaking from the cold, fear, or tiredness. There were threats of punishment for things that seemed perfectly normal, like smiling at the wrong time, questioning decisions, or saying you wanted to visit the city. What bothered Pierce the most was that the person who wrote those pages hadn't been locked up for a real crime or wrongdoing. Her family thought she acted in a way that was wrong, so they put her in jail. There were vague mentions of mental illness and behaviors that made people feel bad, but nothing specific enough to explain that cruel treatment. It was like her unique personality was seen as a threat that needed to be kept in check. Pierce started to get a sense of how long it would take. Some entries talked about how the seasons changed many times and how the years went by, with only the quality of light coming through the small opening, or the weather getting colder and wetter, making the stone structure even colder and wetter. The woman had spent a lot of her adult life in that small space, living a life that was little more than animal survival. But something even more troubling was coming out of the pages. The writing changed in the last parts he could read. It got more resigned and distant, as if the writer was slowly losing touch with reality. She started to see her imprisonment not as an unfair punishment, but as the way things are supposed to be. She wrote about how she deserved that treatment and how staying hidden would keep her family safe. It was the process of someone losing their sense of self and becoming mentally broken until the prison walls were the only thing they knew. Pierce had to choose what to do. He thought about going straight to the county officials, but he knew it would be very hard. The Hole family had a long history in that area. Even though he was a loner, people thought Thomas was a good member of the community. Pierce's proof was circumstantial. Diary pages he couldn't confirm, things he saw himself, and confessions he heard in secret that he couldn't prove. There was also the practical problem of time and place. The authorities were only a few days away. It would take weeks or even months to set up a formal investigation. What could happen if Thomas thought he was being watched all that time? He could get rid of evidence or do something even worse. And Margaret, that woman who was stuck in her own guilt and despair, could face terrible things. The doctor decided to wait until he had more information before taking action. He started asking even more private questions. This time not about the Hole family directly, but about the area's history. He went to the little Baptist church in the valley, where an old pastor kept records of baptisms, marriages, and funerals. He started to put together a timeline in a dusty room full of old books and the smell of old paper. He found out that Thomas's sister Elizabeth had been baptized there many years ago. There were records of her going to church events up to a point, and then there was nothing else. There is no record of a marriage and no other mention. It was like she had been erased from the world of business. When Pierce asked the pastor about her, the old man frowned and said something vague about how the family had said she was nervous and needed special care somewhere else. The official story was that Elizabeth had a mental illness and had been sent to a faraway facility for treatment. It was a story that fit perfectly with the times, when people were ashamed of and kept things like this secret. People wouldn't question it very much, especially in a small town where family problems were seen as private. The story was believable enough to keep people from being too curious, but it was also vague enough that there were no clues that could be followed. Pierce saw the dark genius in it. Thomas and his family didn't need to tell big lies or make things more complicated. A simple answer that fit with the prejudices and expectations of the time would have been enough. People would agree with it because it was easier than questioning it, especially when it meant not having to deal with another family's private problems. But the doctor had an even more important question now. Where was Elizabeth? What had happened to her if she had been kept in that stone building for years, as the diary pages said? When he found them, the chains were empty. Did she finally get away, or did something worse happen? Pierce started looking for clues in places that no one else would. He paid close attention to areas that were far away from other people, patches of land that looked like they had just been disturbed, and places where plants grew in strange ways while he rode through the mountains. The Appalachian mountains were huge, and there were many places where secrets could be buried and never found. These included natural caves, deep canyons, and stretches of forest so thick that sunlight never reached the ground. The other people were also a concern. Margaret had said that this wasn't the first time. How many other people had lived in that building over the years? Did Thomas's grandfather, the scary man that no one wanted to talk about, do the same thing? And what happened before him? Could this horrible practice have started when the property was first occupied and been passed down from father to son as a dark tradition? Pierce was starting to feel the weight of these discoveries in his body. He didn't sleep well because he had nightmares where he heard voices coming from the earth. People he visited on farms said he looked sick and should rest because his appearance got worse. But he couldn't relax. Every day that went by without action was another day that darkness went on without being stopped. At last, he made a choice. He would go back to the whole estate, but this time he would do so openly, with a real medical reason. He would say that he was worried about Margaret's health because she had seemed weak when he last saw her. Once he got there, he would try to talk to her alone and convince her to tell the truth to the police. He knew it was risky, but he didn't see any other way to avoid months of red tape while more injustices might happen in those forgotten mountains. It was cloudy and looked like it might rain on the way to the property. Low clouds hung over the mountain tops like fingers trying to pull everything into a dark, ancient place. The wind brought a cold that cut through to the bone. The locals said that the weather was the kind that meant something was about to change, and Pierce couldn't help but feel that nature itself was getting ready for something big to happen. When Pierce got to the property, he saw something that didn't seem right away. There was more activity than usual. People were coming and going between the main house and the barn, which was very different from how quiet the place usually was. Thomas was in the yard talking to his brothers when they all heard Pierce's horse's hooves coming and turned at the same time. The reception was even colder than before. Thomas walked toward him with steady steps, his body stiff, and his face a mask of careful control. Pierce hadn't even had time to fully relax before he asked why they were there, in a way that made it clear he didn't want to talk. The doctor had his story ready. He said he was worried about Margaret's health and offered her a free follow-up appointment. Thomas thought about this for a long time. His eyes were so focused on Pierce that the doctor felt like he could see every lie and hidden intention in his face. Finally, he agreed, but only if the consultation took place in the main room and he was there. His voice made it clear that there was no room for negotiation, and Pierce knew that pushing would only make people more suspicious. They brought Margaret into the room like they were showing off a prisoner. If it was possible, she looked even paler than before. There were dark circles under her eyes that showed she hadn't slept well. When she saw Pierce, she may have recognized him or even had hope, but she quickly looked away. She shook her hands as she sat in the chair she had been given. The test was a painful joke. Pierce took her blood pressure, pulse, and looked at her eyes and throat. He did all of the normal checks while his mind raced. He had to figure out how to talk to her and let her know that he knew and could help. But Thomas was there, watching everything that was said and done. He was like a shadow that made everything feel heavy. Pierce saw new marks on Margaret's arms during the exam. They were bruises that she had just gotten and tried to hide by pulling up her sleeves. She mumbled something about tripping and falling on a piece of furniture when he asked about them, but her eyes told a different story. A story of casual violence that had become so normal for her that she didn't even try to make up believable lies anymore. The room was so tense that it felt like the mist on a mountain. Pierce could tell that Thomas was paying close attention to everything Margaret said and did. It was clear that she would be in trouble if she said the wrong thing or told too much. The doctor was torn between wanting to help and being afraid that pushing things too soon would make her situation worse. Pierce carefully chose his words when he made his recommendation out loud after the test. He told her that she needed to get more fresh air, go for short walks, and spend time in the sun whenever she could. He said that being alone too much was bad for anyone, and that people needed to connect with the outside world to stay mentally healthy. Not only was each word chosen as medical advice, but also as a coded message meant to plant seeds of doubt or awareness. Thomas's face didn't change as he listened. Pierce just nodded and said he would think about the suggestions when he was done. But there was something in his eyes that made it clear he understood what the doctor was saying and what the deeper meaning behind the seemingly innocent advice was. The mood got even more tense. Pierce asked to use the bathroom before leaving, which is a common excuse that people usually accept. Thomas told Pierce where to go, and Pierce left, but instead of going straight to where he was told to go, he took a quick detour toward the stone building. He needed to check on something to confirm a nagging suspicion that had been bothering him since he got there. The door was slightly open. His heart almost stopped when he looked inside. The inside had been thoroughly cleaned. The chains were gone. It looked like the marks on the walls had been scraped off or covered up with new mortar. Everything was gone. The blankets, the dishes, the diary pages he hadn't taken. It was as if no one had ever been there, as if all signs of being in prison had been carefully removed. Pierce knew right away what this meant. Thomas was aware. He had somehow found out that someone had been there looking into it. Maybe Margaret told him, or maybe he just noticed that some things were out of place. He was getting rid of evidence and getting ready to deny everything if he was caught. The cleanup was so thorough that even if Pierce called the police, all they would find was a shared storage space. Pierce felt Thomas's eyes burning into his back as he walked back to his horse. The man stood on the balcony, still as a statue, and watched him move. There were no threats made in words or direct confrontations, but the message was clear. He knew that Pierce knew, and he was warning that he wouldn't put up with any interference. It was a quiet conversation between two men who knew exactly what was at stake. The ride back was bad. Pierce was now in an even tougher situation. He didn't have much physical evidence, just a few diary pages that could be questioned or thrown out. It was clear that Margaret, his possible witness, was too scared to talk. And the crime scene had been cleaned very carefully. What could he really prove if he went to the police now? The question about Elizabeth was even more troubling. What else could Thomas be doing if he was getting rid of evidence so quickly? If her sister was still alive on that property, she might be in even more danger now. Or maybe she wasn't there anymore, hidden away where no one would ever look, and she would never speak again to protect the family's secrets. Pierce stayed up all night with the diary pages spread out in front of him by candlelight. He read them over and over again, looking for a clue he might have missed or a detail that could change everything. There were mentions of certain spots on the property, like an old oak tree with a strange mark on it, and a rock outcrop where spring water made a small natural pool. Did these places matter? Places where someone could hide, or places with a darker meaning? The storm that had been threatening all day finally hit hard. The rain beat against the windows like hands begging to get in. The thunder that echoed through the valleys shook the whole small house. Pierce looked out the window and saw lightning briefly lighting up the distant mountain tops where the Holloway property was located. What could be going on right now up there all by itself? He thought about Margaret, who was probably alone in a dark room, knowing that he had tried to help and failed. He thought of Thomas, who might have been obsessively going over his evidence removals to make sure that every trace of truth was gone. He thought about Elizabeth, wherever she was, alive or dead. Her story was only a few pages long, written in charcoal when he was at his lowest point. The situation looked hopeless. Pierce was just a traveling doctor with no real power or resources, and he was up against a family that had been hiding its secrets for generations. The mountains were silent partners in crime. Their size and distance made it possible for terrible things to happen without anyone seeing them. And the society of the time, which was full of biases and didn't want to get involved in family matters, was the perfect cover. He couldn't just move on and forget, though. He had seen and learned too much. The words on those yellowed pages weren't just ink on paper. They were the voice of someone who had been silenced, begging to be heard, to get justice, and to be remembered as a person. Pierce owed that voice more than just his resignation. What was the question? The storm lasted 3 full days, turning the dirt roads into rivers of mud and making it impossible to travel. Pierce was stuck in the small house where he was staying, watching the rain hit the mountains hard from the window. Being forced to do nothing for days on end was torture for my mind. His mind kept coming up with worse and worse ideas about what could be going on the hollow property, while the weather kept everyone inside. He took the time to think things through and come up with a better plan. It wouldn't work to just go to the police with weak evidence, especially since Thomas had already cleared the stone building. Pierce needed something more solid, something he couldn't deny. But how could he do that without putting Margaret or anyone else in even more danger? He started writing down everything he knew during the long hours he was alone, making a detailed record of what he saw, heard, and learned. He wrote down the dates of his visits, described the stone building before it was cleaned, and copied the pages of the diary he had found. There would be a record of his suspicions if something happened to him. He put these papers in an envelope and gave them to the farmer who was hosting him, telling him to open them only if he didn't come back within a certain amount of time. Pierce made a dangerous choice after the storm passed, and the world was washed and shining in the weak autumn sun. He would go back to that property, but not by the main road where people could see him. He knew old hunting trails that went around the area. These were paths that the first settlers had used and that were now almost forgotten, covered in plants, but still easy to find if you knew where to look. He wanted to watch the property from a distance for a few days, learn how the family moved around, and look for any signs that might show what was really going on there. He knew he had to be patient and very careful with this plan, but he saw no other way. He had to dig up the truth from those mountains with the few tools he had. It took a whole day to get to the observation area. Pierce had enough food for a week, a pair of binoculars he had borrowed from a farmer who used them to watch animals, and heavy blankets for the cold nights he knew were coming. He found a high spot in the trees that was partly shielded by a rocky outcrop. From there, he could see most of the property without being seen. The first 2 days were very boring. He saw how a farm usually works. Thomas and his brothers worked in the fields, took care of the animals, and fixed fences that had been broken by the storm. Margaret came out on the porch from time to time, but even from a distance, Pierce could tell that she was moving like someone who was carrying something heavy. She never went far from home and never seemed to relax. She was always looking over her shoulder, as if she was waiting for something bad to happen. Pierce noticed something strange on the 3rd day. In the afternoon, when the sun started to set, Thomas would go for a walk by himself to a certain part of the property. It was a piece of land with old trees on it, next to a small stream that ran through the base of a hill. He would stand there for about half an hour, just looking at a certain spot on the ground. He didn't look like he was working or looking at anything. It was more like he was visiting something and paying his respects in silence. Pierce saw this pattern happen again and again over the next few days, always at the same time, in the same place, and with the same thoughtful posture that was very different from Thomas's usual stiff posture. The doctor mentally marked the exact spot, using landmarks he knew he could use to find it later. That place meant a lot to Thomas, and he felt the need to go there often. On the 4th day of watching, Pierce saw something that made his blood run cold. Margaret took a basket of dirty clothes out of the main house and went to the creek to wash them. It was a common job, and it looked like she was doing it by herself, without anyone watching her. Pierce saw a chance. Maybe he could finally talk to her honestly if he could get to her when she was outside the house and away from Thomas. He waited until she was completely focused on her work, crouched at the edge of the creek, scrubbing clothes against the stones. Then, Very carefully moving through the thick plants, he got close enough to her to whisper her name. Margaret turned quickly, and her face got even paler when she saw him. She clearly wanted to scream or run away, but Pierce raised his hands in a sign of peace and begged her to listen. She looked back and forth between Pierce and the house in the distance, her eyes filling with tears. She shook her head over and over again, saying in a low voice that he shouldn't be there, that she didn't get how dangerous it was, and that she had to leave right away. But Pierce wouldn't back down. He said he knew everything about Elizabeth, the stone building, and everything else. He told her he could help and that she didn't have to live that way. There were ways to get out of it. Margaret then fell to the ground, her body shaking with silent sobs that she was trying to hold back. In quick, broken whispers, she told them that Elizabeth had left years ago. The family said she had gone west, but Margaret knew that wasn't true. Elizabeth never really had a choice about what would happen to her. She never got the freedom she wanted so badly. What really happened was still unclear, hidden behind silences and half-truths that the family carefully protected. The family didn't just keep secrets from Elizabeth, though. Margaret said that there were other mysteries in those lands, stories that had been passed down for generations. People in the area knew Thomas's grandfather as a bad person. Rumor has it that his great-grandfather was also known for being strict with people who broke his rules. It was a pattern that kept happening, a dark legacy that was passed down from father to son. Margaret said with a broken voice that the reason was based on a false idea about keeping the family clean and protecting their reputation. Any family member who acted in a way that was thought to be wrong or embarrassing was seen as a threat. The answer was not to get help from outside or just accept differences. Instead, it was to hide, control, and make the problem go away in ways that didn't need to be explained to anyone else. Elizabeth had done something wrong by being too independent, questioning traditions, and wanting to leave the mountains and see the world. This was unacceptable for a family that was obsessed with secrets and control. They made up a story about her being mentally ill and put her in that stone building to break her will to fight. And when it became clear that she would never fully conform to their expectations, she simply ceased to exist for the outside world. As he listened, Pierce's stomach began to feel sick. He was shocked not only by how cruel the acts were, but also by how normal they had become, how they had been accepted as a normal part of the family structure. Margaret talked about it all with a mix of horror and acceptance, like someone who had been in that darkness for so long that she couldn't picture light anymore. He wanted to know why she hadn't tried to get away on her own or asked for help sooner. Margaret looked at him with eyes that had seen and felt too much. She said that Thomas was not only her husband, but also her protector in every way. He had power over every part of her life, kept an eye on her interactions, and made sure she never had a real chance to be alone with strangers. And on top of that, he had broken her spirit over the years with subtle ways of scaring and controlling her that left no visible marks but were still very damaging. She also told me something that made everything even clearer. It was like a business deal that brought her into that family. Her own, very poor family had basically sold her to the Holloways in exchange for land and other resources. She was just over 20 and didn't know what kind of life she would have. It was too late for her to understand what that family was really like. The same mountains that kept her secrets also kept her. Pierce asked the question he was most afraid to ask. Is there someone else being kept a secret right now? Margaret hesitated and looked away. In the end, she admitted that the cousin who lived with them wasn't really a willing relative. Years ago, she tried to leave the family to live on her own in the city, but Thomas and his brothers brought her back, saying she was mentally unstable and needed family care. She had lived in a kind of invisible prison since then, never really free to leave and always being watched. The doctor felt like he had a lot of responsibility. Finally, here he was, with direct evidence that confirmed his worst fears. But Margaret was too scared to testify in front of a judge. And without her help, how could he prove anything? There were no clear records of the people who had gone missing from that family. There was no official record of what had really happened to them. People thought they had just moved away or gone to faraway places. Pierce started to get the dark genius of it. Thomas and his family didn't need to make up complicated stories or cover-ups. They just gave reasons that fit with the biases and hopes of the time. People would accept it because it was easier to accept than to question, especially when it meant not having to get involved in another family's private matters. But the doctor had an even more important question now. Where was Elizabeth? What happened when she finally left that stone building after being there for years, as the diary pages said? Did she get away and start a new life in secret, or did something worse seal her fate in the shadows of those mountains? Margaret didn't have any clear answers, just bits of conversations she had overheard, meaningful looks exchanged between the men in the family, and that one place Thomas went to too often. The stream whispered its secrets, but it never fully told them. The mountains held on to their secrets with a strength that made it impossible to get to them. Pierce started looking for clues in places that no one else would. He paid close attention to isolated areas of the mountains, like patches of land that seemed to mean a lot to the family. The Appalachian Mountains were huge, with many places where secrets could be kept and never found. These included natural caves, deep canyons, and stretches of forest so thick that sunlight never reached the ground. There was also the matter of the others. Margaret had said that this wasn't the first time, that it had happened before and would happen again. Over the years, how many other people had been kept in that building? Did Thomas's grandfather, the scary man that no one wanted to talk about, do the same thing? And what happened before him? Could this horrible practice have started when the property was first occupied and been passed down from father to son as a dark tradition? Pierce was starting to feel the weight of these discoveries in his body. He didn't sleep well because he couldn't stop thinking about all the lives that had been ruined and controlled in that place. His looks got worse, and some of the farmers he visited said he looked sick and needed to rest. But he couldn't sleep. Every day that went by without action was another day that darkness went unchallenged. Someone calling Margaret from the house made them break up quickly. She looked at Pierce one last time, her eyes begging him to see how impossible the situation was. Then she quickly went back to her clothes in the creek, acting like she had been there the whole time. Pierce ran back to the trees, his heart racing, and watched as Thomas came into view in the distance. Even from a distance, his tall silhouette was scary. That night, Pierce was once again hidden at his observation post, and he had to make the hardest choice of his life. He had enough information now, but using it could have made Margaret even more dangerous. But if they did nothing, the cycle of control and abuse would keep going, maybe even into the next generation. There was no easy answer, and every option came with some risk and the chance of more pain. The mountains stayed quiet and kept their opinions to themselves, as they always had. Pierce stayed up all night, watching the lights in the hole go out one by one until only the dark mountains were left. The temperature dropped quickly, and he pulled the blankets tighter as he thought about all the options he had. He thought about every path he could take, and they all seemed to lead to bad things in some way. Pierce made his choice when dawn finally came. The sky turned pink and gold, which were very different from the dark events he was looking into. He couldn't make Margaret testify, but he could write down everything he knew and give it to the police in a way that wouldn't directly put her in danger. He could tell researchers where Elizabeth was buried, show them the diary pages, and give them enough historical background to start a formal investigation. But he had one last thing to do before he left those mountains. He had to go to the place by the stream that Thomas went to every day. He had to see the place where Elizabeth was buried, without any ceremony or recognition for himself. It wasn't just a sick curiosity. He needed to see it for himself, to be able to say for sure that he had been there and seen it. He waited until the family was busy with their morning chores, then carefully made his way down the hill, staying hidden behind the trees. The stream softly murmured over stones that had been worn down by years of constant flow. The place was beautiful but sad, with old oak trees casting long shadows over the ground covered in leaves. Pierce found the exact place he had mentally marked during his observations. There was nothing obvious to tell it apart. No memorial stone, no simple cross, and no sign that someone who had lived, breathed, and dreamed of freedom was buried there. The ground was just a little higher than the rest of the area, and it was covered in plants that grew without being disturbed. It was as if nature was trying to give the place back some dignity that people had taken away. He knelt down and touched the cold ground with his hands. He wasn't very religious, but he said a silent prayer for Elizabeth and all the other people who had been forgotten and buried in those mountains without anyone but her captors knowing. It was a strange moment of connection across time, an attempt to show that someone remembered her and that she hadn't completely disappeared from people's minds. That's when he heard branches breaking behind him. Pierce quickly turned around and saw Thomas standing a few feet away with the same look on his face. The man didn't look surprised. He looked calm, which was scarier than any open anger. He held a farming tool, not in a threatening way, but just like someone who had been working and happened to be carrying it. For a long time, the two men just stared at each other, as if time had stopped. Pierce's heart raced, but he made himself stay calm and not show how scared he was. Finally, Thomas spoke. His voice was calm and low as he asked the doctor what he thought he was doing on his property without permission. Pierce quickly decided to face him directly. There was no point in lying or avoiding the truth. He was very clear that he knew about Elizabeth, what had happened to her, and how she had spent years in prison before she died. He said he knew she was buried there, in that place Thomas went to often, which made it seem like he was feeling guilty. It was strange how calm Thomas was in his response. He didn't deny it, get angry, or try to scare or threaten. He just sighed heavily, as if the weight he had been carrying for a long time had finally become too much. He walked over to a nearby stone, sat down with the tool against his leg, and started to talk. What came out next was a strange and upsetting confession. Thomas talked about growing up on that estate and seeing his father do things he didn't understand when he was a child. He talked about how he learned that some things had to be done to keep the family safe, keep the peace, and keep the Holo name from being tarnished by shame. He talked about a belief system that was so strong that it was impossible to question it. It was just how things were done, and it was passed down as sacred knowledge from one generation to the next. He said in a voice that was almost monotone that Elizabeth had been different since she was a child. She questioned everything, went against authority, and talked about impossible dreams of leaving the mountains and living on her own. To her father, this showed that she was dangerous and rebellious and needed to be fixed. Thomas had seen his sister go from being full of life to being quiet and distant, and then one day she was just gone. He said he did it, and that he did what his father told him to do without question, because that was what was expected of him. But he said he would always remember how Elizabeth looked, especially in the last few days before she died. It was the look of someone who had given up on everything, even living. And that stayed with him for years, even though he tried to make sense of what he did with the twisted logic he had learned. Pierce listened to all of this with a mix of horror and something he didn't want to admit was compassion. Thomas wasn't really saying he was sorry, but for the first time he was saying out loud that what his family had done and what he had done was very wrong. It was a crack in the carefully kept armor, a moment when humanity came through layers of conditioning. The doctor asked why Thomas kept doing that with Margaret, his cousin, and anyone else in the house if he knew he was wrong. Thomas didn't say anything for a long time before he spoke. He said he didn't know how to be different because the weight of tradition was so heavy that even when he knew it was wrong, he couldn't see a way out. He felt like he was stuck on tracks that had been laid down long before he was born, and he didn't have the strength or courage to get off of them. Pierce understood that this was a sad thing. Thomas was both a victim and a perpetrator. He was shaped by things that happened before him and would keep happening after him unless someone had the guts to break the cycle. But admitting this tragedy didn't change the fact that people had died and suffered because of what he did. Pierce told Thomas that he had to tell the truth about what he knew, and that there was no moral choice but to do so. But he also gave Thomas an unexpected chance to do the right thing in a way that might help him make up for his mistakes. He could go to the police on his own, tell them everything, and work with them completely. Maybe, just maybe, the truth would bring him some peace. Thomas thought about this for a long time, staring off into the mountains around him. In the end, he slowly shook his head. He said he couldn't do it because it would be terrible for his family, and he would rather leave the dead buried and carry his burden alone. There was a sense of resignation in his voice, as if he knew he had chosen a path that he couldn't go back on. The doctor then realized that this would not be easy or satisfying to fix. Thomas wouldn't suddenly turn into a hero and confess everything and accept punishment. But he also wouldn't try to stop Pierce from doing what he needed to do. It was a strange deadlock, a moral gray area where both sides knew the truth but couldn't agree on what to do with it. Thomas got up, grabbed his tool, and started to walk away. Before he left, he turned around and said one last thing. Pierce should be careful in the mountains because accidents happen a lot, especially to people who don't know the area well. It wasn't a threat, but it wasn't just friendly advice either. It was a sign that he was only willing to be passive up to a point. After Thomas left, Pierce was alone, thinking about everything that had just happened. The talk had been strange, showing him levels of psychological and moral complexity he hadn't fully expected, but it also made him more determined. He would leave those mountains and do the right thing, even if it meant facing personal problems. The shadows had kept things hidden for too long. It was time to bring light to the surface, even if that light showed things that most people would rather keep hidden. Pierce's heart was heavy in a different way when he left those Kentucky mountains. It wasn't the weight of resolution or justice served that made it heavy. It was the weight of knowing that some darkness is too old and too deeply rooted to be ripped out and shown to the light. The shadows of the Appalachians keep their secrets safe in a way that time and human will can't change. He rode back along the narrow trails, watching as the morning mist hung over the valleys, just like it always did, not caring about the dramas that were happening below it. He still thought the mountains were majestic and beautiful, but now he saw them in a different way. Each lonely valley, each hidden property among the peaks, and each family living far away from the rest of the world held the potential for untold stories and silences that lasted for generations. The doctor couldn't stop thinking about Margaret, the woman who was stuck between guilt and despair. He thought about whether she would ever find peace, or if she would stay in that dark house until she died, keeping secrets that would never be fully revealed. It was especially cruel that those mountains could make people think there was no way out, and make them help imprison themselves. And Thomas, the man who was both a victim and a criminal in a cycle that had started long before him. Pierce now understood that evil doesn't always come with a tail and horns, or make itself known in such a clear way. Sometimes it wears the clothes of tradition, family loyalty, and the need to look good. It hides behind excuses that make sense to people who grew up in its warped limits. When Pierce finally got to civilization, he had to deal with his own moral problem. He had written down everything and had enough proof to start official investigations. But he also knew that the process would take a long time, be hard, and maybe not work. The Hole family had strong ties, and finding out things that had been hidden for so long would not be easy. More importantly, whatever he did would affect the people who still lived on that property, especially Margaret. Pierce was very careful in the days that followed. He quietly got in touch with some officials, planting seeds of doubt without making direct accusations that could be easily dismissed. He gave his papers to people he could trust, so that if something happened to him, the record of what he found would not be lost. He could only do these small things which may not have been enough because of the limits of his job and time. As it always does in the mountains, time went on. The seasons change, but the essence stays the same. Pierce eventually left that area. As an itinerant doctor, he traveled to other places, communities, and patients. But he never forgot about the property in the Kentucky mountains. He never stopped thinking about Elizabeth and all the other people whose voices were silenced. Years later, he would hear rumors and whispers about the Hole family. They said that Thomas had aged too quickly and that his face was lined with deep lines that could have been from regret or just being tired. About how Margaret had been seen in town once, looking paler than ever, and with that same empty look in her eyes. About how the estate seemed to be getting more and more cut off from the outside world, as if it were retreating into the shadows that had always kept it safe. Of course, the stone structure stayed. Things like that last longer than memories, confessions, and even human lives. Its walls would hold echoes of pain that no one else would hear, and the stone itself would absorb secrets. It would stand there for decades to come. Maybe one day, people who live there in the future will wonder what the land was originally used for and make up stories that are far from the truth. Pierce learned something important in those Kentucky mountains, that justice isn't always possible, that truth doesn't always win, and that sometimes darkness stays around because it is too old and too deeply rooted to be completely gotten rid of. But he also learned that it matters to bear witness, that it matters to refuse to forget, even if it doesn't lead to a solution, and that remembering wrongs is a way to fight against silence. The Appalachian Mountains still have their secrets today, in remote homes, in valleys where the fog never completely goes away, and in families that keep traditions that no one else understands. The shadows stay. Some stories don't have clear endings. Some mysteries will never be solved. Some truths stay hidden, not because people forget them, but because they are too heavy to be found. And maybe that's the most disturbing lesson of all, that we can walk through beautiful places, admire the beauty of mountains, and enjoy the peace of remote areas without ever really knowing what's going on beneath the surface. Things that look one way may not be what they seem, and the distance between places that makes them beautiful also makes them great for hiding secrets that should never see the light of day. The story of the Hole family didn't end when Pierce rode away. It kept happening in the shadows, following patterns that had been set so long ago that they seemed unavoidable. And somewhere in those mountains, maybe even today, there are places where the past isn't completely gone, where echoes of old pain still ring out for those who are willing to listen, and where memories that refuse to be forgotten are hidden in the shadows.